Previously, we created the ability to add expense categories. Now we're going to implement the ability to pass the expense category forward to the list of expenses, and then we're going to display that list of expenses associated with the category, and we're going to implement the ability to add a new expense to a category by passing the category forward to the view controller where we create a new expense.
In order to pass the category forward from the categories view controller to the expenses view controller, we need to go to our expenses view controller file, and we could do it right below our date formatter. We need to actually create a variable to hold the category that we're going to pass forward. So let's create a new variable, and let's call it category, and this is going to be of type category optional. Dale, why does this need to be optional?
Because we initially have it set to no category at all, and we're going to pass the category forward, but prior to one being set, it'll be nil, so it has to be optional.
Exactly. So now that we have this variable category in our expenses view controller, let's actually pass the category forward that the user has selected. Let's go to our categories view controller, and let's implement a prepare function. And the prepare function that I'm talking about is prepare for segue. And in here, this function is called right before the user segues from one view controller to another. So here's our chance to get our destination view controller that we're segueing to. And from there, we can actually pass information forward to that view controller. So let's begin by creating an if let, and let's call this constant destination equals segue.destination. And if we look at the type of destination, it's of type UI view controller. And the reason why I have this in an if let is because we don't just want a UI view controller, but we want to cast this as an expenses view controller. This is an optional cast because this is a downcast. So that means that this might fail. And now, if it is actually an expenses view controller, we have it unwrapped. With this now, we need to get the cell that the user has actually selected. To do that, we can do another if let. And let's call this selected row equals, and we need access to our table view, which is called categories table view. And table views have a property on it called index path for selected row, which returns an optional index path. And we want to get the row out of that index path.
Can we chain those?
Exactly. So what this is this is a pyramid of braces essentially, and it's not good programming style. So how do we clean this up, Dale?
Well, we can do multiple let statements in the if let and separate them by a comma. So we could just get rid of the curly brace in the if.
And then now we can delete. And now we're chaining them together. If destination exists and selected row does not, we'll simply move on from this if let and this code won't be executed. Now there's another way we can actually clean this up. And since we only want to execute code if both the destination and selected row exist, else we're never going to do anything else, let's change our if statement to a different type, which is called
a guard let.
A guard let.
Else.
So I'm going to change my if to a guard let. I'm going to, after my last let, I'm going to put else. And now I'm going to return out. So now essentially we will only execute our code if both destination and selected row exist, else we will return out of this function. Now that we have this, let's access our destination view controller, which we have called destination. And from there we can access the category. And let's assign it the category that was selected by accessing the categories array and giving it the selected row. Now that we've done that, we've actually now passed the selected category forward to the expenses view controller. So let's navigate back to that, and let's actually show the expenses that belong to that category. If I navigate down to where I implement the data source, we can access our category, and we have a computed property that we created on it for category and category plus core data class. calling it's a computed property of expenses, var expenses. So let's access that computed property. And from there, let's access the count of the expenses. And this is optional. This function does not return optional, so we're getting an error. How can I fix this, Dale?
Nil coalescing operator, 2 question marks, and alternatively we could return a 0 if we can't find any expenses or the category.
So what this is saying is that it is saying if category doesn't exist, return 0. If expenses don't exist, return 0. And if both of those exist, return the amount of expenses in that category. Now that we have specified the number of rows in section, let's actually initialize the cell for row at index path. The very first thing that we need to do is get the category for this cell. So let category equal category. And now from there we need to get the expense. So let's actually change that constant to the expense for the cell. Let's access our expenses array. And we need to access the one for this row, and this would be indexPath.row. This is going to be an error thrown because expenses is of type optional, so I need to mark it of an optional. And that means our expenses of type optional. So we should probably unwrap this to make sure it's always safe before we initialize our cell. Now that we have this, let's actually initialize the cell properties. So the title of the cell for its text label will be the name of the expense. And we need to handle the subtitle. The subtitle for this cell should be the date. Oh, and I'm getting yelled at because I forget my question mark. But the subtitle of the cell should be a date. And it should be well formatted for the user, meaning we need access to our date formatter. We have a date formatter at the top, but date formatters to turn a date into a string require the date to not be optional. So to fix that, let's unwrap our expenses date. Let's call it date equals expense.date. And in here, let us access our detailed text label, text is equal to, and let's get our date formatter that we have initialized at the top. And there's a function here to turn a date into a string, Dale. What is it?
String from date.
String from date. And let's pass in our date. Now what that will do is if our date exists, it will format it nicely for the user and set that equal to our subtitle of our cell. If I build and run this right now, and we selected category, it is actually working. We're passing that category forward, and we're showing all the expenses for that category. We have none right now, so let's fix that by adding a new expense. So we've passed the category forward from our categories view controller to our expenses view controller. Now we need to pass that forward one more time to our new expense view controller. Let's navigate to the new expense view controller, and just like we did before, let's create a new variable. Let's call this category. And this is going to be of type category optional. And now since we have a spot to actually pass it forward to, let's navigate back to our expenses view controller. Let's go right below, add new expenses IB action, and let's implement our prepare for segue. Instead of getting our selected cell and passing that category forward, we only have one category to worry about. But just like we did before, we need to get our destination. Let's use a guard let destination equals destination. Oh, segue.destination. Else return. And now that we have access to that destination, let's access the destination. Oh, and I forgot something right here, Dale. What did I forget?
You need to cast it as the type.
As new expense view controller.
And new expense view controller, does it yet have an expense property?
It has a categories property.
I mean a categories property?
It does. We just added that.
So,
and this is where we're going to store the new category that we're going to pass, right?
Yep.
So navigating back to our expenses view controller, destination.category is equal to category. Now that we have that, we need to implement our logic to be able to create a new expense. Let's go to our new expense view controller, navigate down to our save expense, and let's actually implement our logic to create this expense and save it to our managed context. So let's first get all of our properties. So it would be let name equals name, text field dot text. Let amount text, let's call it amount text, equals amount text field dot text. And this will come in handy in a second, but let's add a nil coalescing operator and an empty string. So that means that if amount text field dot text does not exist, we're essentially going to initialize amount text to a blank string. Now that we have that, our expense class requires this to be a double. So we need to convert this string into a double. So let's create a new constant and call it amount equals. And Dale, what's the function to turn a string into a double?
Well, we can initialize a double using double and then init from string.
Amount text. And this returns an optional amount. Our class for expense actually requires it to be not optional. So let's use another nil coalescing operator to initialize it to 0. Why does the double initializer, Dale, return an optional double?
Because the text we pass it may not be a number.
Exactly. So that's handling all those cases if the user doesn't input any string, if the user inputs no number, and now we have those cases covered. Now that we have the amount, let's get our date. Let date equals datepicker.date. And now let's handle the creation of our new expense. So this is going to be an if let scenario with if let expense equals. Then we have our expense class, and let's initialize that with our properties. The reason why I put this in an if let is you'll notice right here that this is a failable initializer because it will fail if the managed context is not there. So with that, we can pass our name, we can pass our amount, and we can pass our date, and we can unwrap our expense. Now that we have our new expense created, we actually need to assign it to our category. So we could do category dot, and the very first function that pops up is the one we exactly want, add to raw expenses. And so select that, and let's pass in our new expense. Let's talk about what I just did there for a second. The very first thing is I created a new instance of our expense class. And then after I created that new instance, I called our category that we passed forward, and I called the function on it called add to raw expenses. If I navigate to our category plus core data properties, these are the properties that were generated from our entities in our core data model inspector. And if I navigate down, when you establish a one-to-many relationship, Xcode generates these functions for you. For example, insert into raw expenses, remove from raw expenses, so on and so forth, and most importantly, add to raw expenses. Remember, we're calling this raw expenses because our relationship is called raw expenses because that's how we named it, to remember that it is an Objective-C type. So going back to new expense view controller, we're accessing our category that we're passed forward, and we're calling it add to raw expenses, and we're giving it our new expense. This establishes the relationship for both expense and category and makes everything happy. Now that we've established the relationship, let's save our expense from the managed context. And to do that, we need a do block because the code can actually throw an exception. Let's access our expense. From the expense, let's access the managed object context. And let's access its save function. And notice the keyword after the documentation says it throws, means it can throw an exception, meaning that we need to mark this line with a try keyword to indicate that it can throw an exception. And I'm going to get an error here because I'm not handling exceptions. So to handle exceptions, we need a do catch block. And here we can print off expense could not be created. And now it should all be happy. With that said, after we save the managed object context, we don't actually want to remain on this view controller, do we, Dale?
No, let's pop it off and go back to the previous one.
So we need to access our navigation controller. And from our navigation controller, there is a function called pop. And let's say we want it to be animated by passing in true. At this time, we can build and run this.
But are we yet?
But we will have a problem presented here in a moment, but we can still kind of work with it for a minute. So, Apple products, I'm going to create a new expense. Expense is going to be an iPhone 10, amount 1,000, and we can save it. The save was successful because you noticed it popped off that view controller from our view stack, but we don't yet see anything here. If I navigate back to the categories and then select the Apple products, you know it will appear here now. So we need to fix this bug by going to our expenses view controller and implementing a new view controller lifecycle function. View will appear, and here's our opportunity to actually reload the table view every time it's about to appear. So let's access our expenses table view and let's call reload data on it. Look good, Dale?
Looks good.
Let's build and run this. And now I could go to Apple products. I could create a new expense. I could say Apple car for a lot of money. And now I could click save and it appears in our expenses. All of this is persisted for us to core data. And I can even prove that by reloading the application in the simulator, selecting Apple products, and now you can see both of the expenses belong in our category.